And welcome to the Lineup Breakdown Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post this at BChat50, and I'm here to look at the big winning lineups from Week 8 at both FanDuel in their $4 million Sunday Million contest and the Millionaire Maker contest at DraftKings. And our first winner was West Coast 4 in FanDuel's Sunday Million. And I'm guessing you probably surmised that this lineup featured some players from that shootout in New Orleans between the Giants and the Saints, and you are correct in that assessment and that guess. Basically, pretty educated guess, I would say, given the scoring. And it all starts at the top with Drew Brees, who was $7,900 and was owned on just 3.8% of the FanDuel Million rosters. Brees' fantasy scoring output accounted for 22% of this lineup scoring, which is a remarkable number. And as I know in today's article analyzing these lineups, video game numbers is an expression too often thrown around these days, but they are exactly what Drew Brees put up this week. He spun 7 touchdown passes, threw for 505 yards. I mean, these are numbers that are just remarkable. They were game-changing, and at a 3.8% ownership rate, immediately gave West Coast 4 a huge edge in the competition, against the competition. And it's a great way to start, but this wasn't the only pick that they hit on. They nailed their backs as well, starting with the chalk play at running back this week, Todd Gurley. San Francisco's nightmarish season continued. They got gashed by Gurley, who surpassed 125 yards rushing for the 4th straight week. He is arguably the best running back in football right now, and that's pretty remarkable for a rookie coming off of a serious knee injury, but he's been fantastic. He had a 71-yard highlight reel touchdown rush in the game. He looks great. He was owned on 45.1% of rosters, and if you faded him, you certainly put yourself in a hole right out of the gate. West Coast 4 did not fade him, and got a healthy scoring total from Gurley that, paired with Brees, was a great foundation for this lineup. One area where this big winner went contrarian was Ronnie Hillman at running back, 4% owned, so another low-owned player to join Drew Brees as a high scorer. Hillman scored the game's first 2 touchdowns in a game that the Packers were favored in Denver, but Denver's defense showed up in a big way. Peyton Manning turned back the clock and looked good, and the running game did something that it hasn't done all year, and it looked very good. Hillman wasn't even the leading rusher on his own team. C.J. Anderson actually rushed for more yardage, but Hillman found pay dirt twice, and at that point, everything after was gravy. So Hillman turned in a good effort, and at just a 4% ownership rate, that is definitely a difference maker, especially at $6,100, since it allowed some spending elsewhere. Getting back to the chalk picks, Stephon Diggs was owned on 30% of rosters with just a $6,700 price. It's easy to understand why. He's been the apple of Teddy Bridgewater's eye since getting inserted into the starting lineup and since getting regular playing time. He continued a scorching hot start to his NFL career. He was targeted 12 times, and according to ESPN, Bridgewater's threw 30 passes, but only 25 were targeted towards receivers, so almost exactly half of Bridgewater's passes that were intended for wideouts, or for pass catchers, I should say, went to the rookie Stephon Diggs, who reeled in 6 catches, totaled 95 yards, and a score. He's been on fire, and until his price goes up, it's hard to envision him seeing an ownership dip, especially with as frequently as he's getting targeted and with as productive as he's been with those targets. Next up is another difference maker, another sub 5% owned player, and this was your stacking partner for our big winner, West Coast 4. Brandon Cooks was paired with Drew Brees, caught a couple of touchdown passes, and by stacking the duo, basically he got double the pointage for the touchdown grabs. You got 6 points for each of the touchdown receptions on Cook's part, 4 for each of the touchdown passes to Cooks from Brees, and that's 20 points just on touchdown passes from Brees to Cooks. So that pretty much epitomizes why there is value in stacking your quarterback in one of his pass catchers. But a little bit more on that later in the podcast as we look at the next roster. Overall, Cooks turned in a fine 688 and 2 line. The yardage is solid. The reception total was solid, but it was those 2 touchdowns that were a big deal. And the fact that they were hooked to Brees's production was a big deal as well. He wasn't the only productive receiver in that game, and he wasn't. And another productive receiver in that game came on the other side of things, and that was Odell Beckham Jr. And OBJ's been battling injuries this year, but he looked a lot more like that phenomenal rookie that grabbed headlines and basically captured the heart of the fantasy community, especially the daily fantasy community last year. But the injuries have sapped his production a little bit this year, and because he set the bar so high last year, just being very good hasn't been good enough in the eyes of many daily gamers. And at under 10% ownership, 3 touchdown receptions on 8 grabs for 130 yards was a monster game changer. Beckham's score was the second highest on this team at 35 points. You combine his and Drew Brees' scoring, you're talking about over 82 points just between 2 players. So that is unbelievable. The back and forth nature of this game with all the point scoring, the lack of defense. On that note, how does Rob Ryan still have a job? But OBJ was phenomenal this week, and expect that ownership rate to rise exponentially this week with him facing the Buccaneers, who ranked dead last, covering #1 receivers, and OBJ coming off of a monster effort. But for Week 8, West Coast 4 was certainly the beneficiary of Odell Beckham Jr. being under-owned and turning in a monster performance. Didn't get a monster performance from his tight end, Greg Olsen, but Olsen was 14.8% owned and really the second most popular tight end this week behind Tyler Eifert. And he outperformed Eifert. Wasn't a big margin. It was an 11-point difference with Olsen scoring 16.9 points and Eifert scoring just 5.9. That 11 points makes a difference, and it certainly helped contribute to the $500,000 payday for West Coast 4. Looking at the kicker, not a lot to analyze with the kicker, but Dan Bailey, just $4,600, only $100 more than the minimum salary for a kicker on the site. Did enough, scored 14 points. And when you get 14 points from a guy who allows you to save money at the position like Dan Bailey did, that's ultimately all you can ask for from your kicker. Finally, the defense special teams of the Houston Texans, $4,700, priced around a lot of other elite units. And the Texans have not been an elite unit this year, but Zach Mettenberger's had a funny way of making defenses look real good by not moving the football with the Titans. That was the case this week. At under 5% ownership, Houston scored 20 fantasy points, and that's a difference maker in GPPs. When you can get 20 points from your defense, regardless of what you pay for them, that's great. And when you can get it under 5% ownership, you're really setting yourself apart from the pack. So hat tip to West Coast 4 for putting together a roster that featured some chalk plays that hit, but also avoided some chalk plays that didn't, and hit on some gems. So under 5% ownership players and units like the Texans defensive unit that really set them apart from the pack and helped them take home the crown this week in the FanDuel Million. Next roster we're going to look at is the DraftKings Millionaire Maker winning lineup from GV Alstyle, I believe. I apologize if I'm pronouncing that user's name incorrectly. I'm going with what I got. And we got some overlap between these rosters, but there is actually a surprising number of differences. Part of that's the extra position with the flex and the lack of kicker on DraftKings, but we start with overlap right at the top. And Drew Brees, $6,700, just 3.2% owned, actually a little bit lower owned on DraftKings than on FanDuel. And I mean, what else can I say? Under 5% owned, scored over 50 fantasy points at DraftKings. That's a heck of a way to start your lineup. And at just the 3.2% ownership rate, it was a huge edge on the competition. Next up with Todd Gurley, who was even chalkier on DraftKings than on FanDuel. Another overlapping pick between rosters here. 61.7% owned against the 49ers. Went off, was just $6,900 this week. Or I'm sorry, it was just $6,300 last week. It's just $6,900 this week. So go ahead and expect him to be high owned again. Maybe not quite 61.7% owned, but probably not that far off with just a $600 price hike and plenty of value places to surround Gurley with. Go ahead and follow GV Alstyle's pick from last week. Carry him over to this week and build your roster around Todd Gurley again. Nice source of salary relief for this Millionaire Maker winning roster was Darren McFadden at $3,800. The matchup wasn't good against the Seattle Seahawks, but the 12.7% ownership was largely the product of the fact that McFadden was named the starter earlier in the week. There was certainly going to be touches coming his way, and they did. The fact that the game didn't turn into a blowout really played into McFadden's hands. 20 carries, and game manager Matt Castle also tossed him the football 8 targeted him 8 times, successfully completed 6 passes to McFadden for 49 yards and at a full point per reception. McFadden totaled almost 11 points through the air and added a little bit on the ground. That type of scoring was plenty to pay off a $3.8K salary that Darren McFadden featured. And next up is one of my favorite picks of the week. Was a really well sought out sneaky value play. And if you've seen the DraftKings commercials by now, you're probably familiar with the one that Edward Norton narrates and talks about sleepers and where you can find sleepers and how these sleepers can set you apart. Well, Tavon Austin fits the bill as that type of sleeper that set this roster apart at just 6% ownership. He actually outscored teammate Todd Gurley this week. Scored on the ground, scored through the air, rushed for 21 yards, added 98 yards on 4 receptions through the air. So did a little bit of everything. And Tavon Austin, I've called him a gadget player in the past. I still think that that is a fitting title. He is undersized, but that's a gadget player that I'm going to go ahead and guess that GVL style is pretty happy with as a newly crowned millionaire this week. Next up is Odell Beckham Jr., whose ownership rate was lower here on DraftKings than on FanDuel on the other big winning roster this week. And he beasted this week. He clowned the secondary of the Saints, put in a big effort. Going to see a high ownership spike this week after the big performance. You're going to see some people chasing last week's points, but the matchup certainly dictates using him next week. But for last week, certainly a difference maker at just 6.6% ownership. Next up was a much chalkier play and a very popular play around the DFS industry, and that was 20.5% owned Julio Jones, most expensive receiver on DraftKings at $9,200, but certainly paid that off by reeling in 12 of 13 targets for 162 yards and a touchdown. And Julio Jones, sure, he lost a fumble, but I think that's forgiven by GVL style this week after netting a big win. And as I alluded to earlier in the podcast, no Brandon Cooks is a hook here with Drew Brees in that Saints stack, but instead Benjamin Watson at $3,500 on DraftKings was very cheap and significantly outperformed the duo of Tyler Eifert and Greg Olsen. Outscored the two of them combined, actually. And not only did you get a higher scoring effort from Benjamin Watson by his monstrous game, but you also got savings that you could spread out elsewhere on a guy like the most expensive receiver, Julio Jones, who was found on this winning roster. So nice combination of, I won't call them stars and scrubs, but pricey superstars and underpriced gems that hit. And that was one of the keys this week to this Millionaire Maker winning roster. And at 12.7% ownership, not super high, but certainly not the only gamer on Benjamin Watson, but definitely the most profitable gamer on Benjamin Watson this week. Next up at Flex was Jonathan Stewart, who was grossly underpriced at 4.1K. I'm actually a little bit surprised to see that he was only 12.7% owned, but great matchup with the Colts. Got the ball a lot, as was expected, and paid off that salary pretty easily. And this was the lowest scoring player on GVL Styles roster this week, but or GVAL, I suppose. We'll throw out the alternate pronunciation in the hopes that between the two I've gotten it right. But Jonathan Stewart paid off the modest salary and allowed for some serious salary spending elsewhere. So big hit for Stewart as just being salary relief and being just good enough. And then another overlapping, I won't call it a player, we'll call it a unit again, between these two rosters was Houston Texans. So 2 big hits on sub 4% owned Houston Texans defense this week. And I don't need to rehash it again. They flat out took advantage of the fact that Zach Mettenberger is not a very good NFL quarterback, couldn't move the football. They lack a running game in Tennessee. And, I mean, I guess Titans have had enough this year of not being good enough offensively and not being good enough in general, because they did fire Ken Wisenhunt on Tuesday. And, well, I say that these two gamers are glad that that wasn't the case headed into this week, because they certainly profited off of the Houston Texans getting the most out of Ken Whisenhunt running another inept offense this year. That's going to do it. I hope you guys gained something from looking at these rosters, because there's certainly plenty of money to be won in the upcoming weeks, starting with this week. We've got content at dailyfantasycafe.com, such as our tools and our articles that can help you find some of these hidden gems, low-owned players that complement the chalkier plays really well and have helped these two gamers win some big money this week. So check out dailyfantasycafe.com for your NFL needs, but also check it out for the NBA content and NHL content that we have up now, with those seasons just beginning, and continued great college football content as well. With that, I'm going to sign off. Check back next week, and hopefully it's you that's hearing about your own winning roster. Good luck.